very big, very new trend, where, the thinking is essentially, how can we sort of understand human intelligence and the human brain better, so that can inform how we build like artificial forms of intelligence. And it's both answering the question of like, how can we build them better? So how can they actually like perform better at a number of like different tasks?
Welcome to the ReThink podcast. Today I have another guest from re.Mind, and it's Joao. Introduce yourself, Joao.
Hi everyone. So I'm Joao, Portuguese by background, based in London, or like between London and San Francisco. My background is in medicine, so I trained as a medical doctor here in the UK at Imperial College, which is where I'm sort of still based. Did a lot of work around like neuroscience. That was really like my topic of interest. Through the space of psychedelics, got really interested in the sort of like translational component of neuroscience research into sort of real impactful novel therapeutics in the neuropsychiatric space. And on a day-to-day basis, run re.Mind. That's the largest focused fund on neuroscience and behavioral health. re.Mind is a $130 million fund. We invest in a technology agnostic way in neuroscience and behavioral health, meaning we really look across the innovation spectrum in anything that can deliver large-scale impact and is really ambitious in trying to change how we think about behavioral health and neuroscience. So we cover everything from neurotechnology. So these are like devices that, for example, are trying to read and write information to the brain. Writing as in like neuromodulating the brain. So thinking through like precision, neurological therapeutics, but also like reading. So how can we understand and read information from the brain better, and then do all sorts of useful things with this information. We also invest a lot in like just more traditional therapeutics. Like we're really interested in what are like completely new ways of investing in mental and brain health. What are like completely new ways of thinking about how we can treat the brain, and how we can drug the brain in many ways. And then we do a lot also like in digital health tech, so thinking through novel care models. How can we expand access? How can we use technology to creatively like solve a lot of the supply side like mismatch solutions in terms of like practitioners and mental health practice and brain health practice. And of course, we try to invest a lot at the intersection of all of these. Like at the intersection of these is sometimes where there's a lot of the most like interesting and ambitious ideas. So we also, hence the reason why the fund is like so sort of broad in terms of areas of investment, but quite narrow and very specific with one common goal, which is the innovation in this behavioral health and neuroscience space.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And this was also one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, because there are like not a lot of in venture capitalists that have this narrow field, which is from my perspective one of the most exciting ones. And I wonder how you like made the transition basically from a trained physician to somebody that is in venture capital. So because it's quite different areas of expertise. Well, sounds amazing.
I mean, I think there's a lot of on the clinical side, like for sure, it's very, very different. I think my interest like always lied more on the academic side, so more like on the research side of things. And there, I think there is a lot of intersection. I think a majority of like innovation in neuroscience that eventually leads to like better drugs, better devices, novel ways of like understanding the brain, So both at this sort of foundational infrastructure layer. So, maybe developing the tools or developing the knowledge of the brain and mind that then it allows for this more like vertical innovation of, let's focus on this specific pathway in the brain and let's try and drug, this or that molecule because we sort of understand that this might be really important in some form of like schizophrenia or dementia or something like this. I think there's a lot of intersection. I think what motivated me in particular was really like the translational effort. So I guess like in academia, a career in academia really involves a lot of like progressive steps. So you basically have to you might have like some very sort of ambitious scientific question that you want answered, but you can't really get the funding to answer this question unless you do all sorts of other things before that and publish and everything. And back in the day, you look at this like shiny, interesting side, which is the venture side of things, which the truth is somewhere in the middle, of course. But and you see that it's actually possible now to just raise a bunch of like for-profit money and go out and try and answer like these very ambitious scientific questions directly without having to jump through all these hoops because people trust that if you're able to answer some of these questions, then there will be like a lot of value created somehow. And I think that this is a trend that's not too old. I think it's like quite recent even, but I think it's happening more and more. Like I think even if we think about like the future of, and this is maybe like a slight tangent from how I ended up there, but yeah, even if we think about like the future of where scientific discovery is heading, I think more and more we're going to see like a lot of interesting science come out of like large for-profit companies, so like traditional companies, and on top of like academia.
Yeah. I can clearly see that intersection, and one thing is, as you mentioned, is like the question of funding. Where comes the funding from? And sometimes there is an overlap of like let's say commercial interest versus academia interest, but sometimes there is not, and the incentives are kind of not divergent, but not always overlapping. So I can understand that this route might be something that is intriguing. And one thing that I feel like, and maybe you can correct me on that because I'm not from the academic world, but I feel like a lot of times when you are in a commercial setting, is you focus more on the practical side of things and ask yourself, okay, we have this tremendous insight or tremendous breakthrough, and how can we use it in order to make it practical as an application or a therapy intervention, you name it. So I think there is like something that is converging, but sometimes it's also totally different mindsets.
I mean, yeah. Absolutely. I think, the lines are definitely blurry. And I think more and more like you're able to get like very far even inside of academia. It also just functions at like a slightly different pace. I think there's pros and cons between, like running some of the science in academia versus running it in companies. I think there's now like a lot of solutions that are like sort of hybrids of the two, which are like really interesting. Like, focused research organizations and some of these things. But really like especially like in behavioral health, when we think about like mental health and when we think about neuroscience, one of the big advantages is that so many of these efforts have to be so multidisciplinary in some ways. That it's very hard to get access to that resource and execute like at a fast enough pace in non-for-profit organizations. There are like some institutions that are non-for-profit that are purpose-built exactly for this sort of multidisciplinary interaction, like ARC, like the Allen Institute, etc., that do this at scale, and they do it very well. But typically, the better structure is or typically like the structure that's most set up for success could be one of just a company. On the other hand, of course, like the counter argument to this is that a lot of times it's very hard to get funding as an entrepreneur or as a founder. It's hard to get funding to build something that will then eventually lead to the thing that you're actually building. So you're sort of like you're like one step removed essentially. So it's not always easy, but I think that it's these sort of efforts that work at the infrastructure layer of trying to move the field forward, and really advance like really differentiated ways of thinking, whether it's about the science or about care models or whatever it is, that I think that we personally at re.Mind are like most interested in backing. And yeah, I think it's like these very ambitious approaches that will ultimately like, become some of the world's largest companies, which like we really believe is possible in neuroscience. And it's sort of unlike any other sector in healthcare in that sense.
Was there a specific moment? Because I imagine, because this is like Fund 1, I guess, right?
Yeah.
When I remember correctly. Was there a specific point where you and the other guys from re.Mind were like, okay, brain health, neuroscience, applied neuroscience, this is going to be the frontier? And was there a reason why you dedicated the thesis around that?
Yeah. It was definitely informed, right? Like, we very much like the team is sort of like started in the space of psychedelics, like especially with Christian, like one of the co-founders. Like he really built and scaled like two of the largest like psychedelic companies. They're now like NASDAQ listed, and this year hopefully will be one of the first FDA approved psychedelics. So that was sort of like, let's say, the initial sort of momentum, but the thesis itself was built on a much like broader foundation. I guess like exposure from the psychedelic space, we saw two sort of large pools of catalysts happening at the same time that would enable for like very, very large scale innovation to happen in neuroscience and behavioral health. And these two pools of capital are like quite different. So on the one side, you have the scientific catalysts, and this is a bunch of different things. But in to sum it up, in essence, it's really like significant advances in neuroscience and how we understand the brain and the mind, from everything from like very pure biology to developing tools to be able to sequence the brain, understand and image the brain at a much lower costs. All of this leading to like the one trend, which is we're developing novel insights into how the brain and mind works at sort of an unprecedented pace. So that by itself is breeding ground for like massive amounts of innovation. But this was paired with a much more like cultural catalyst, which was during COVID, you saw like a massive amount of destigmatization around like mental health. But at the same time, you saw a massive amount of cultural attention being paid to neurological health, for example, and dementia and the aging population. So I think these two things together like really propelled like a massive amount of capital to be deployed into the space, a massive amount of policy work to be done to ensure that these things are like well funded, well reimbursed, etc. So all of these things moving in the right direction just gave us a lot of confidence that there was going to be like a massive wave of innovation in the field of neuroscience. I think that wave is like literally just starting, and we're already seeing like very large results and outcomes from this, but it's going to continue. And the reality is that neuroscience and behavioral health exists in this weird pocket of healthcare where the scale is often like unlimited in some ways. Yeah. And the customer or like the market doesn't end in healthcare. It usually, like a lot of the technology usually has properties that emerge like beyond healthcare. So, look at the field of like brain-computer interface. Yes, we're starting with like very paralyzed ALS type patients, but the end consumer is like everyone in the world. If BCIs do become like the future of like the next computing platform, the next way we interact with like digital interfaces. So, and this is true, I think, across neuroscience. And just going back to like why re.Mind should exist is there was no funding, there was no funder of the space that really like recognized this and could support companies and build towards like this level of ambition. I think there's definitely like a lot of healthcare investors that exist, and they know how to back like the sort of traditional healthcare propositions, but backing companies with this thesis, with this level like of ambition, and really like trying to guide them in that direction. I think that's the reason basically for re.Mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I observed that as well. And one thing that I particularly think on the one hand is like a strong suit of applied neuroscience, and on the other hand is it's maybe a bit harder to convey to people outside from the industry, is that commercialization is a topic which is not easy to understand, because as you said, like you have like the normal the health sector, but you have so much like applied or translational applications which can be a total different consumer. And so I what I can see or what I observed so far is like commercialization is it's not 100% figured out right now. And so I really try to get your opinion on that, what you see or what you have observed in your portfolio companies.
So how do we see commercialization across the portfolio?
Yes, because for what I have seen, there is no clear way for that. There are like totally different possibilities, and as you mentioned, like there's this transfer effect of applications also outside of like typical medical spaces.
Yeah. I think like each company or like even each subsector within the re.Mind portfolio like has different commercialization strategies. I would say like the neurotechnology, even within neurotechnology, I think there's like multiple different commercialization avenues. I think it's always a consideration between like what's achievable technically today and who can benefit from that, the value that you're able to create today. So if you take like the invasive brain-computer interface companies, the commercialization, at least to start with, needs to be very much in the medical domain, because the value versus the invasiveness curve. So, i.e., like, who will be willing to get like brain surgery to get brain chip to control digital interfaces today, given the invasiveness of a brain surgery, both from like what's the real risk and the perceived risk perspective, like culturally. I think it's mostly going to be like people who are like really, really affected by this. So it's, it's going to be patients who have spinal cord injury, who have ALS, who, really, really, really need this. So you need to start in that domain. The benefits of starting in that domain as well is you can, given how much value the patients are extracting from this, and the market more generally, you can charge very high prices. So you can really maybe price even like in the hundreds of thousands per implant, per device, which, as you can imagine, like over time, invasiveness is reducing. So like more and more people will be open to getting this device. So invasiveness will reduce, costs will have to reduce, and the value will also have to increase. So all these like three dynamics will have to move at once so that you can move like further and further upstream in the market. Eventually, potentially even to like consumer markets, right? Although like I think that's probably like way down the line. However, like other non-invasive technologies, I've seen in the market people take like all sorts of different approaches. Some people go directly to consumers. Some people do all sorts of different things. Especially when the technology like has a lot less risk, right? Which means you have that optionality. However, like personally, I'm still a fan of um, starting quite medical and clinical. I think it,
Mm-hmm.
generates like the evidence needed. It gives like the credibility to the approach and whatever you're trying to do in a way that if you just go like directly to consumer, it doesn't. I'm thinking more like from a sort of therapeutic perspective. So for example, you have all these companies that are trying to do like neurostimulation for X, Y, or
Mm-hmm.
Z.
Yeah.
And you have a lot of these consumer devices for like relaxation and all of this
Yes.
stuff. I do prefer like the sort of like more medical route. So that's neurotech. I would say like on the more traditional biotech tech biospace, like it's really it's very common. It's like, yeah, it's just you have to run clinical trials, you have to go through healthcare. As a commercialization, you might be able to sell, like if you have an interesting platform for drug discovery development, like some sort of artificial intelligence or something that will help you discover newer, better drugs or move them through clinical trials faster, or like work with patient populations. You can also partner with pharma like relatively early, so people who are already working on this, that's very common. And then on the digital health and health tech side, again, like I know a lot of companies are going like direct to consumer with all sorts of different propositions. But again, here I prefer the more sort of like healthcare grounded approach. If you're offering like some sort of therapeutic benefit through healthcare services, be it like therapy, be it psychiatry, be it whatever it would be, I think you're better off. Again, ultimately, like cash pay markets and consumer markets in healthcare, both in Europe and in the US, are still like relatively small. They're a small portion of what like working with the traditional health systems is. Yeah. Anyways, like super super broad overview, and I think the answer here is like every single company has a different commercialization strategy, and it
Yeah.
needs to sort of fit their strategy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And what do you think about these hybrid approaches? Because I have seen a couple of companies, because of the regulatory burden is sometimes quite high in the beginning, that they start with something that might be clinical grade as a device or an intervention, and then eventually, after like gathering some sources and some traction over in the consumer pocket, to go into the regulatory space. So for one instant that comes to my mind is, for instance, Pulsetto is like a vagus nerve stimulation product, and now they are now working on a clinical grade one as a medical device.
I think it all depends on the efficacy and the effect size that you're able to generate.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, my my general feeling, and this is like very general, and I'm happy to be proven wrong, but I think anything on the therapeutic side that can be used as like quote unquote a consumer device,
Mm-hmm.
the only reason it can be used like in an unregulated setting and consumer and stuff, it's because it's probably not generating like large enough efficacy and effect sizes.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's always like a risk reward trade-off. And if the risk is so low, if the risk is really low that it's like unregulated, probably like the reward or the therapeutic effect is also going to be somewhat capped or limited. I'm sure
Mm-hmm.
there's like a bunch of exceptions to this, but I think that that's generally the case. But otherwise, like if there is consumer demand for these products,
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any reason. Like that sounds like a sensible strategy, and it's one that I've definitely also seen. It's one that I've seen many times also, um, and I think it makes sense. And there are like look, there are examples of there's examples of success cases around this. Maybe not in the sort of neurotech stimulation side, but there's a bunch of success cases on the supplement side, like things that were initially developed as supplements that then that are unregulated and actually like create large effect sizes that then sort of like transition into proper uh, pharmaceutics that just are able to charge like 20 times more, get some sort of IP protection around it, and so there are examples of success. It's just I think in the neurotech space, generally, that's sort of the framework that I look at it.
Okay. What sub trends have you observed in that space, in neurotech, in behavioral science, and all these things? Is there a current a couple of sub trends that you are like closely
Yeah,
observing? So I'm curious about that.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so maybe again, like uh, going back to like what's sort of like the my framework for looking at the spaces. So in general, I do think that neurotechnology is the only way that we have truly of achieving states of like precision psychiatry. So of being like truly precise. I think my feeling is that it's definitely going to be through the field of neurotechnology. We're not like even close yet, but that's generally the direction. And what this means is like extremely high levels of efficacy on most people for a range of like neuropsychiatric disorders if you're really able to modulate the brain precisely. So what does this mean what does this mean in terms of trends? Like what's sort of like the one thing that we would really want to be able to do? It would be sort of being able to interface and at the same time stimulate the whole brain anywhere you'd want it with a very sort of high level of precision. To date, a majority of like neurotechnology has, in order to get to like very deep brain structures or regions that are like non-cortical, you'd have to go invasive. So typically, you'd have to have implants of like deep brain stimulation systems. And traditionally, like non-invasive approaches have had a real hard time of like getting anywhere close to important in the brain. I think now there's a bunch of novel like technology modalities that do enable like this deep brain access completely non-invasively, such as like ultrasound, so focused ultrasound, and things like temporal interference, etc. These are really like new paradigms of technology that allow for this deep brain stimulation. So that's like one sub trend, and another like very important sort of parallel sub trend is okay, it's great to be able to stimulate these deep brain regions and be quite versatile about how you go about this, like stimulate multiple places at the same time, etc., etc. But you need some form of like high resolution continuous reading out of the brain. Otherwise, you also have absolutely no idea like what you're actually stimulating, which itself is highly problematic. So I think you need both, right? And again, like reading out of the brain, if you want to do it non-invasively, traditionally, like the best that we have is these like massive fMRI machines that cost millions of dollars, need to be like very well sort of Faraday cages and everything. Like they're just very hard to operate. MEGs, for example, is another one. So I mean, it's really like hard to operate equipment and equipment that's not suitable for behavioral health and
Yeah.
neuropsychiatry. So another really interesting trend is like, okay, how can we get like higher resolution, spatially and temporally reading out of the brain to be able to understand like what's going on in a much more like continuous basis. And again, here you have significant like improvements on on existing technologies thanks to the advances in AI. So like I think if you think about very like basic technologies like EEG, like 10 years ago, the level of signal you were able to extract was like highly limited. I think today it's a lot better. It's still inherently limited for sure, but it's like definitely a lot better. And then there's like a bunch of other like novel ways of also like measuring and reading out of the brain things like again ultrasound, fNIRS, OPMs, mags. So there's some like really interesting approaches there as well. And I think these are like, let's say, the two really cool sub trends in neurotechnology.
Can you walk us through ultrasounds, what they actually are, and how you can use it, and how
Sure.
it's able to modulate the brain?
Sure, and I'm gonna butcher it because I'm by no means like very technical in this space. But so in order for for brain stimulation, you have transcranial focused ultrasound, and essentially, like as I understand it, um, there's these like massive machines built by this company called Psychedelics that I think they got a lot of press coverage relatively recently, which basically showed, and this is like easier to understand, but if you focus ultrasound, so these like sound waves, if you focus them, imagine you have a helmet around your head and you have like all these different like sound waves converging on one very, very small spot. What these like massive machines were able to do is they were able to ablate neurons. So they were able to carry out a form of, let's say, like what was traditionally done with neurosurgery, only like non-invasively with ultrasound. But what was found was this was at a very high intensity, so like a lot of power going through these sound waves. Essentially, what was found like quite a lot of years ago, like was that if you tune down the power to like low intensity, to a much lower intensity, you're not ablating the neurons, but you can cause them to depolarize. So you can use like these focused like ultrasound beams to depolarize the cells themselves. And this is essentially like causing stimulation. So imagine you move a cell mechanically enough that you cause it to fire, and then this causes like others to fire, etc. And it just creates like brain activity. And
Okay.
you can also do the same to inhibit them from firing. So theoretically, like you can do both. The important thing is you can modulate. So you can do neuromodulation with this type of like focused ultrasound. So now this is traditionally done in like a massive, massive machine. Like, so could be useful for like a once in a while type intervention. Where the field has been going recently is, okay, how can we take this like massive machine that's like, in a room, and how can we make it more of a like at home use type helmet? Because if you think about, neuropsychiatric indications, you do want something, you need something that you can be used repeatedly. Like if you're going to change like brain circuitry and modulate the brain, it's not going to be like a one-off, like one and done type of intervention. It's something that you'll need to do like quite continuously and repeatedly. And so that's essentially like where the thinking currently is. And there's a bunch of like very important sort of engineering issues that still need to be that are being worked on to be overcome, because like these large machines are running a brain imaging like fMRI at the
Yeah.
same time as they're stimulating, so they know exactly where they're stimulating. With low intensity like focused ultrasound in these sort of at-home versions, you need to solve for that. So not having like brain reading all the time, i.e. like what are other like proxies of brain activity that you can measure, or is there a way to sort of like just read this brain information at home? And then there's a bunch of other like skull attenuations. So like your skull is like very porous, sound waves like diffract massively through the skull. So how can you solve for this? How can you reduce the number of transducers, i.e. like each individual pulse of sound waves? Because these are like also super expensive. So to make the devices more affordable. So a lot of engineering issues, like, but a lot of promise, like a lot of research has been published, especially like in chronic pain, for example, in anxiety, in OCD, even in depression, that shows like really, really promising results for like focused ultrasound to be used as an intervention for neuropsychiatry.
And you mentioned that that's a repeated usage. So what is, for instance, like I just imagine a therapy for, let's say, depression with this kind of ultrasound device. How long would you use it to have a measurable effect?
Well, it's unknown yet. I guess that's the question. Like that's work that still needs to be done. But if you look at this, if you look at the, and even like even for example the field of TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation. So these are like large magnetic coils that stimulate much more cortical areas of the brain. Ultrasound is typically used to go deeper in the brain. But even there's like massive sort of unanswered questions around like what's the best protocol, what creates like long-term responders versus like what leads to relapses. There's a lot of interesting science being done there. I mean, there's protocols like Saint, for example, that were, it just published their second RCT recently. This is looking at, a very, very high intensity, very precisely like neuronavigated with fMRI, very high intensity, 5 days of inpatient being, 10 hours in a chair a day. And then there's other, and this seems to show like pretty high efficacy. I think they still need to build their evidence base like further, but the results are really promising to date. And then there's other like more novel interventions, which are like, okay, let's just stimulate you like one day, like super, super intensely and see how it works. And these are also like quite promising. I think what's currently approved, it's more continuous. I think it's like 12 weeks or something, going in a couple times a week. I don't know exactly what the protocol is, but and I'm sure the same exploration will be had in the space of ultrasound. Which is like a lot of different things will work. And this, again, like just going back to the point, I think this is why we need like better measurement, because we just need more sort of objective, better measures of what good looks like essentially for some of these outcomes. So
yeah. Get it. And you mentioned also temporal neuromodulation.
Yeah.
What is that exactly? So I just have seen that it also works with waves in a way.
Yeah. So again, I'll definitely butcher this. A temporal interference is like is a neuromodality. It's a neuromodality. It's one that's really, really interesting. Evidence in neuropsychiatry is emerging, but it's still limited. But really, like the idea is, you have these sort of like you have these things like either side of the brain that create like large electric fields at very high frequencies. Say so like one electric field is at like a 2000 like hertz frequency, the other is like a 2010 hertz frequency, so slightly mismatched. And the envelope, so the place where these two electric fields meet, which is, if you imagine you have one either side of the brain, will be like in a deeper brain region. They cancel each other out, and so they create this opportunity for like entrainment of the neurons at that 10 hertz frequency. So it's not like ultrasound where it causes like this direct depolarization. What entrainment creates is like it makes the neurons like more likely to fire if at that sort of like specific frequency. And so like there's, but in any case, it's still very much like a neuromodulatory effect that they're able to achieve. Very similar in some ways to ultrasound, even though like mechanistically different. And, the potential is also like, again, it's really, really broad. So the idea is like, once again, you get to these deeper brain regions. These deeper brain regions, what's usually referred to as sort of like your reptile brain, is where people think you can actually generate like very like much larger effect sizes for a lot of these conditions, especially like in neurology. So things like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, etc. Like the pathology is usually in these deeper brain regions. So if you're able to modulate this, you're able to generate like much larger effect sizes than what's previously been attempted and done. So that's another like interesting modality.
Okay, thank you for explaining, because I was totally
and it's
curious
not going to be a very
it.
good. It's not a very good explanation, I don't think.
But nevertheless, it's already like one step further than I got before that, and I think it's quite interesting to see yeah, how much like different modalities there are, like non-invasively, but like have this effect that is almost what used to be by surgical precision in the past. So I think that's quite remarkable, just
Yeah.
to hear that this is possible. This is like in now people are trying to solve that, and so for me, it's super curious to hear. And yeah, and I think when you have already like could give me already like a high level understanding, that's already remarkable, and let's see how far it takes me from there.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
It's an interesting space. It's an interesting space for sure.
indeed it is. And one thing that I was wondering, do you see like a paradigm shift that is currently happening, but most people are not like being aware in that space, or maybe also slightly outside of the space?
Mm, I think there definitely like there is definitely a paradigm shift in terms of like the attention being paid to like neurotechnology. So all these different technologies that we were just talking about. I think now it's becoming like, you know, a very not now, but it's already is like a very sort of hot area for investments. So that's definitely like, you know, people are increasingly realizing like how valuable these technologies can be if they work and if they're scaled. Um, of course, there's now more recently, like because of what's happening with artificial intelligence and etc. There's this whole sort of shift towards the field of neuro AI as a tool for not only like building better artificial intelligence models, but also like more robust and safer artificial intelligence models. This is definitely like a very sort of very big, very sort of very new trend
Mm-hmm.
where, you know, the thinking is essentially how can we sort of understand human intelligence and the human brain better so that that can inform how we build like artificial
Yeah,
forms of intelligence.
yeah.
And it's both answering the question of like how can we build them better, so
Mm-hmm.
how can they actually like perform better at a number of like different tasks, but also at the same time how can they be more robust and safer. So you know, like human intelligence in most part is like pretty robust and safe. So it's an excellent sort of like scaffold to start with, to then try and, you know, like put this sort of like learning and understanding into the artificial intelligence models themselves. So this is definitely like, and it's a very recent, it's a pretty
Mm-hmm.
recent paradigm shift, but it's
Yeah,
definitely like a recent one, and one that holds like a massive amount of intersection with all the other stuff that we
yeah,
were talking about just
yeah.
earlier in the neurotechnology space. Just because you know, like what is the area that's like collecting brain data, that's understanding neuroscience, that's like really moving that field forward, and how can we cross the bridge between the two? So that's one interesting, yet still very sort of nascent, very early, and very theoretical. Like I don't think there's like good evidence for sort of any of this being applied yet, or like there's some evidence but very little evidence. So it's a very nascent field, but it's definitely like a shift, and it's like an emergent shift. It's one that we would have never predicted, like, you know, 5 6 years ago when we started with re.Mind.
Yeah, that's really exciting to hear, and then also it's correlated with something that I just recently got to know, is that basically there some argue that we have a scaling problem with the current version of neural nets, so the large language models in that sense, and probably there is another paradigm shift on the horizon, because one thing that I learned so far is before that, in particular, ChatGPT was able, or OpenAI was able to just have like these breakthroughs just by increasing or the size of the model, and the curve was exponential at some point, but now it seems like they are at diminishing returns. So they are really looking for like a different way to approach it. So I'm super curious about that, and this also correlates with what you were saying right now, and it makes so much sense.
Yeah, I know, 100%, 100%. And
Is there?
it's interesting, like the sort of like the bidirectional relationship that exists here, which is I think there's also a lot that neuroscience can learn um, from the field of AI.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of, you know, like all these efforts both around like AI scientists and everything, but also like I just think that there's sort of like this very deep intersection between the two fields, where there's like a lot of, I think, interesting stuff to be discovered and explored. So yeah.
I mean, this is also, I mean, I have a background in technology, so the reason why I was interested in neuroscience from the beginning was more that I had this innate I was just drawn to technology, but at some point I just was super curious about humans, and then you come to psychology, and then from psychology, at least from my perspective of view, I try to like understand the brain more, and then all of a sudden you're at neuroscience, and I feel like and that's what makes it so exciting, that it's so converging with so many different fields, that I think like if you can work in some capacity in that area, it's just super exciting to see.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And at all levels, like I think, of course, like this neurotechnology stuff is interesting, but we really try to explore these questions of, you know, what does the sort of future like? What are some of the most ambitious approaches at all levels? Yes, neurotechnology, but also like on the biotech and tech bio side, and also like on the digital health and health tech and care delivery models and this sort of stuff. So
Yeah. I mean, this leads me directly to the next question: is what are you seeing totally different from what is currently observable in the market in the next 5 to 10 years?
what are we seeing that's like totally different?
Yeah, what you feel like that's a total different perspective on where we see
Yeah.
like different things going, that is maybe
Yeah.
controversial to others.
I think one thing that's and this is like on the care delivery on the healthcare side, and I still need to sort of like solidify my thinking here, but like definitely one thing that I think is changing and needs to change is so much of the efforts like in mental health have been to sort of like improve access in one way or another to like existing mental health interventions, and existing mental health interventions in most cases just mean like access to like psychiatry and therapy, especially access to like therapy. And I think that's great, and that's very much like needed, right? But when you think about the scale of the mental health problem, I think it's fair to say that therapy is not a very good intervention, in the sense that it's like highly, no matter what you do to try and improve access through policy, making therapy cheaper, making, you know, like donating to whatever centers and stuff, like inherently therapy is still very much like a one-to-one, human-to-human type intervention that's highly heterogeneous in terms of quality.
Yeah.
And overall, even when it's high quality, very much like limited in its effect size. And regardless, it's been this sort of like predominant intervention, and sort of where a lot of people have spent resources and money like trying to scale. And on the for-profit side, there's been a lot of successful companies that have scaled this just due to this sheer like demand and size of the issue. But I think that all of these companies are really sort of like only scratching the surface of the outcomes that are that you're able to achieve in this space. So, think of the Headspaces, Lyras, etc. They're all unicorns, but I think that's really just scratching the surface, because you're fundamentally working with an inherently, like, a massively unscalable form of intervention, which is this one-to-one, highly heterogeneous, not very effective way of treating patients. I think if you think about the future of psychiatry and mental health, more and more we're going to have, like, just better, like, interventions that are inherently, like, inherently scalable and don't have this, like, cap on scale, because they're not, like, dependent on people. And I'm thinking of things of the likes of, Spravato, also TMS, other forms of neurotechnology, other forms of devices, other forms of, like, psychedelics, etc., that are all coming into market. And these things have, like, much, much, much higher effect sizes. They're a lot less heterogeneous. They don't depend on like, the provider as much. And so when I think about, like, where the future of mental health is going, I would really think that, especially, like, with new discoveries coming down the pipeline, I think there's definitely going to be, like, a big shift from, traditional mental health care to the more sort of interventional mental health care. And this will mean, like, a shift in a bunch of different things, like from service provision. And we're actually, like, we're working in a company doing exactly this on the interventional side. But I think that that's essentially where the space is moving. I still think therapy will always be, like, a really important part of things, and traditional, like, antidepressants and all these things, like, they definitely have a role to play, a big role. But if you think about, like, the 80-20 of what's gonna, like, drive a majority of the value to solve the mental health crisis, it's gonna be coming from the space of, like, novel, better interventions.
Okay.
Yeah.
That sounds amazing, and it sounds also like a lot of work is going to go into that field to reach that, and unfortunately we don't have much more time to dive into that. Joao, it was a pleasure meeting you, speaking with you.
Yeah, for sure.
You broadened my perspective, and hopefully we might do it in another time with much more deep dive into other topics, and topics that we just scratched on the surface right now.
Sounds great. Cool. Thank you very much.